Alright, class, welcome to a social study lesson. Today, please write on the top of your page Social Studies 8th, 10.7 for Lesson 7, Unit 10. And today we're going to be talking about the Plains Indian Wars. Starting with the vocabulary, we have a horde, assimilate, and domesticate. And as always, follow along as these will be the answers to your questions. So starting with the first part of this, we're going to talk about the most important events in the United States during the period from the 1815 to 1877. It would involve the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. Many things were happening at this time: foreign affairs, and along with that, the expansion of the West. New railroads were tying into the nation, and it was making it possible for settlers to move into a new territories of the West, which is including Mississippi. New settlers came into conflict with the Indians of the Great Plains in the 1830s and 1840s, and settlers were just passing through the Great White Plains on their way to Oregon or California in those western states. The Indians did not often interfere with the wagon trails, however, they wanted to be left alone to hunt buffaloes and follow their way of life. When settlers moved into the plains to stay, the situation changed. They brought cattle into the ranch of the buffalo and they fenced off farms. And the Indians and settlers were in each other's way as the population of settlers grew. This also brought the Indians land and reduces their range when the government came into play. And gold was also discovered in Colorado and the Black Hills of South Dakota. This brought thousands of miners into the Indian lands in danger of losing even more territory. The Indians finally decided they would have to push back in order to preserve the way of life and remaining lands. There were treaties, but the government was not honoring them, so the Indians did not feel obligated to honor them either. The Plains of the Indians were divided into these main groups. The Blackfeet of Idaho is one of them, and the Crow of Montana. Different areas. The Sioux of of Dakotas, which includes South and North Dakota. In 1851, the government gathered Indians from the tribes and brought them into council in Wyoming. Officials of the government asked the heads of the tribes to work out an agreement that would limit the range of each tribe, and the reason for the agreement was, according to the government, was so that the tribes would not come into conflict with the remaining territories that they bought over. And the government was making it possible for the United States to deal with the tribes individually and as they took away the lands. And this type of policy was dividing the Indian tribes into separate territories called the concentration. And to some extent, the policy worked and kept the Indians from banding together in opposition to the government. So we have the Bureau of Indian Affairs. A new government agency was formed to deal with the Indians. This agency, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had been part of the War Department, but it was transferred to the Department of the Interior of 1849. When the Indians were at peace with the nations, the Bureau managed the relations with the Indians, and during that time of war, the Indians were dealt with by the army. The Bureau could have helped maintain peace with the Indians. However, it was filled with corruption, and many of the agents were dishonest, took advantage of the Indians in every possible way, and stole money earmarked in the support of the Indians and gave them cheap merchandise. So now we have the Sand Creek Massacre, which in 1864, Colonel J.N. Chivington led 700 troops in the raid at the Cheyenne village at Sand Creek in the southeastern Colorado. The miners in the area also reported trouble with the Indians, and Colonel Chivington was determined to rid the area of Indians once and for all. In reality, he hated Indians and wanted them to be all destroyed, and forced attacks on the village and killed more than 100 men, women, and children. And these attacks were condemned as outright murder, and many Westerns and abhorred by many Easterns. But Colonel Chivington and his men were never pushed out of the massacre at Sand Creek. This event, when the Plains of the Indians as a whole, led to a major war, and because of the sacred grounds of the Black Hills of South Dakota, they were being encroached upon by miners and the government, and eventually the Sioux lost this territory to the government. So that was a major event that happened between the Indians. Perhaps the most famous battle between the Sioux and the army was fought at the Little Bighorn. The Sioux have been off their reservation in southern Montana and have fought several skirmishers with the army. General George A. Custer was placed in charge of the party of the soldiers looking for the Sioux to force them back into the reservation. As he neared the Sioux encamped along the Bighorn River. And General Custer made several mistakes, including splitting his forces and ignoring orders from his superiors. Moving on, it talks about a lot of the trans-constitutional railroads of 1887. Then now we go into the Donsk Act, which by the late 1880s, the Indians were defeated and unable to continue the war. The government then passed several pieces of legislation to try and domesticate the Indians. The most important of these laws were the Dawes Act, passed in 1887. This allowed the reservation to be broken up into individual tracts and give the Indian families. The Dawes Act and other laws were attempting to undermine and eventually end the Indian cultures. The government wanted to assimilate the Indians into white culture. Though the laws were somewhat successful, the Indians still realized their values of their tribal heritage, and they had worked hard to preserve their culture. And though most American Indians considered themselves to be Americans, they also wanted to remember that they are Indian as well. All right, guys, that's lesson 7. Thank you for tuning in.